By a couple of our students, Vanessa Francis, who graduated last fall, and she actually has a job working in cardiac rehabilitation, and that's where she is today. So I get the privilege of sharing a lot of the work she did. Likewise, a couple of students in our lab, I got to give them credit. Vanessa back there also did some of this work as well. And I'm going to talk about some of what she's doing this semester that's relating to this. Yasmina as well, so you can give them a thanks. What we're going to talk about is basically EKGs, and I know some of you have had my classes, and that brings back fond memories, maybe not such fond memories. And today we're going to look at a little bit more in-depth way to assess EKGs, potentially to not just diagnose obvious cardiac issues, but potentially diagnose sudden cardiac death, which in athletes has received a lot of recognition and critical acclaim, especially over the last decade or so. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to really spend a little more time just explaining some of the background of what sudden cardiac death is, how we detect it, some basics as far as EKG to kind of get us all up to speed. And so that's going to be a lot of what I'll talk about, and then a small part will be actually what we did, what we found, and some conclusions we drew from that. So let's just start with some basics. When we talk about sudden cardiac death, the working definition I'm going to use is simply this, that this is death that's occurring typically in some athletic environment that doesn't have anything drug-related, pulmonary-related, or another obvious etiology. Now, one of the things you'll see, and we talk about this, is that it can be difficult to distinguish some of these. Reality is that not every SCD has an obvious sole factor. And there are going to be pulmonary issues, there are going to be drug-related issues, which are going to play a part. So this can get a little bit murky. And it's important because the overall incidence is actually higher than we probably want to recognize. Overall, it's in the ballpark of about 1 in 40,000. When we talk about higher-end athletes, Division I, Division II, there's actually research that says this occurs in near maybe 1 in 3 or 1 in 4,000, which is really, really high. We see actually these prevalence rates are actually higher in males, about 2 times more in males, and about 3.5 times higher in some ethnic groups, particularly African American. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. This does occur in some sports more than others. We see this a little more in basketball, football, activities that tend to have a lot of start and stop, high bursts of speed, then times of rest, more so than in other activities. And not surprisingly, a lot of the times we hear of this in the news tend to be basketball, football, those type of activities. So let's get some of that background here. When we talk about SCD, there are a lot of causes, and I really could spend an hour going into some of the etiologies of what these are. This is not med school, so we'll try to keep it somewhat simple. One of the most common is what we call hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And this is a broad term for some enlargement of ventricular mass, often due to some genetic abnormality. Marfan syndrome was one of the first ones we discovered, though there are many more now, where there's some change in ventricular muscle that's not simply due to activity. And that's going to be key because one of the biggest issues in looking at EKGs in athletes is that athletes are not normal. And I say that in a very honest way. They are engaging in activities which should cause changes in the ventricle and in the rest of the heart. Being able to differentiate that abnormality, which is normally abnormal, to actual issues that are clinical issues can be difficult, and that'll be a recurring theme. Other ones we see, coronary artery anomaly, which unfortunately is very difficult to detect with an EKG, near impossible. And unfortunately, when we see that, usually the first sign is death, which is not a good sign. Right ventricular dysplasia, we're going to talk a little bit about arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, which is a big concern in other parts of the world, not so much in the US. Dilated cardiomyopathy, electrical abnormalities, we'll get into some of that when we talk about EKG, QT intervals, things like that. And then we can't rule out coronary artery disease. Now, typically this is not an issue in college athletes. We typically don't talk about this until subjects are over in their 30s or 40s, but it does happen in a few percent of these cases, and so we can't ignore that as well. Though for our purposes, it is so rare, we really don't acknowledge it a whole lot. So how do we test for this? I mean, if this occurs so often, there's got to be a blood test, a thing we can do. Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. Historically, what we do, and in fact, even in 2018, what is still one of the most common methods of screening is simply getting history, asking questions, asking an athlete things about chest pain. Do they have unusual pain? Do they have shortness of breath? Do they have times they feel like they're going to pass out? Things like that. Though those can be somewhat arbitrary and not always have very clear answers, and clearly you are relying on the subject's honesty, and I know PBA, we're a Christ-centered university, so we're honest, but not everyone always is. And so that can be a little difficult. So we use the EKG, which we're going to talk about a little bit today, though it is not a perfect tool by any means. If you have the capability, using ultrasound, doing an echocardiograph is helpful. But again, the facilities you need, the personnel, adds another layer of cost to be able to do that. And this is key because today in 2018, there isn't a great consensus on which of these, all of these should you do. In fact, in the United States, the most common practice is simply just history, medical history, and that's it. Getting an EKG is not mandatory in most programs. We do see it in Division I athletics, but even here at PBA, not mandatory. And so we're going to talk about why that's the case. And since I'm talking about EKG, you would think that should be the case, but it's not so cut and dry. Some of these other ones are quite costly. And so a lot of the issue and the reason we kind of dove into this is to answer this question, can you really detect this? In the 30, 40,000, one out of these, can you really see it before it happens? And that's really the big question, the big controversy. EKGs are great. Unfortunately, historically, the number of false positives, in other words, the number of abnormal EKGs that actually aren't abnormal can be really high. And in fact, some of the research says upwards of 40% of false positives occur. In other words, 40% of the time you may think something's abnormal and it's actually normal. Well, the problem is, as a clinical tool, that is not helpful. I mean, imagine if your credit card didn't work 40% of the time. You would throw it out. And so because of that, using EKG in the United States is not common. Other places in Europe, it actually is. And that's been a huge concern of how can we get this to be more reliable. So that's a lot of the challenge we had. And so I want to understand some of the basics of EKG, and then I want to move us to what we did in our study. This picture, it's not me. This is Wilhelm Einthoven. He discovered the electrocardiograph in the 1800s, actually won a Nobel Prize for it in 1924. And what's fascinating, and in fact, I was sharing this with my advanced clinical class this past week, this technology for an EKG really hasn't changed much in a century and a half. We now use electrodes and, we have Windows 10. But aside from that, and what's fascinating, what he did is he actually had an individual put their hands and arms actually in salt water. Those are buckets of salt water. Salt carries current. And he's able to measure that current through some string. This is actually a galvanometer. And the string would vibrate. And he has two magnets. You can't see them really well in this picture. And these magnets cause oscillations in this string to vibrate much more. And you can take pictures of these. Now, in the 1800s, they didn't have iPhones. And so he actually used photographic paper, threw it up on a wall, and boom, he'd have an EKG. Technology's gotten a little bit better, but the science really is nearly identical. And that moves us to today. Today we use electrodes, we use chest leads. And so in our study, we did what's called a standard 12-lead EKG, where we're looking at very similar things that Einthoven did more than 100 years ago. Now we use electrodes, we don't use salt water or anything like that. We have a computer, it does it very quickly. His device costs 600 pounds. Ours weighs like 10 pounds, so a lot better. And it allows us to get what we know as a standard EKG. Now I'm going to just share some of the basics of this. I know some of you, if you've had me in classes, this is on exams and stuff, so you know it. On a standard EKG, we detect some waves. P wave, which denotes atrial depolarization. This is the atria of the heart contracting, depolarizing. The QRS, which is the ventricles doing the same. And then a T wave, which is the ventricles repolarizing. And so we often refer to these waves, P wave, QRS, T waves. We often refer to segments, and I'll talk a lot about the QT interval, ST segments, because each of these gives us a very unique picture of literally every aspect of conduction going through the heart. And if there's anything abnormal, in theory, we can see it on here. And so what this gives us is a 12-lead EKG, and in fact, this is actually one we got from our study. This is normal. If you're trying to read this, pretty normal. And so what we see here is that literally these electrodes allow us to see unique pictures of the heart. And I often tell students and other individuals, an EKG is kind of like 12 pictures of the same thing. Imagine if we all took pictures of this room, it would have the same people, but it would be different, right? Some people's heads we'd see the front, some we'd see the back. Same people, different pictures. Good way to think of EKG is all of these leads, AV1, AVR, AVLVF, the V1 through V6 chest leads, these are all pictures of the heart at the same time. And it's an incredibly valuable tool. If there's anything conduction-wise that's a little bit off, in theory, we can see it on here. And clinically, this has been used for years to look at things like ST segment changes. If someone is having chest pain angina, really good chance we'll see changes in EKG, and it's very obvious. If someone has atrial fibrillation, which you may not know what that is, but you've seen commercials for medications for it, AFib, we can easily see that on here. Ventricular tachycardia, things like that, we can easily see. And historically, the EKG has been used to analyze those more obvious cardiac abnormalities. Unfortunately, when we talk about sudden cardiac death, we almost never see any of that. In fact, if we look at an EKG similar to this, it'll look really normal. And so the challenge has been, well, okay, this is great if you have someone who has chest pain. This is great if you have someone you know has had a heart attack. But this is not great for a 20-year-old healthy athlete in the prime of their career to even try to guess that they may die of sudden cardiac death on a field. And so this has been a challenge to figure out, okay, how do we use this? How do we get past the basic assessment of this? And so in the early 2000s up to 2011, this was a big controversy. In 2012, a number of cardiologists through the American College of Cardiology came together and tried to come up with some criteria to give a really precise way, to really pick this apart and see, is there things we can find in here that maybe we didn't see before to maybe get a glimpse of people who will have or potentially susceptible to SCD. This conference was held in Seattle in 2012, and what came from that we call the Seattle criteria, which is this really in-depth criteria for analyzing an EKG. I'm not going to go through all this. I'm not going to quiz you. A lot of this is a little bit more advanced EKG reading. But this allows us to hopefully decrease these false positives. In other words, if we see something that fits these criteria, we can hopefully be a little more certain that it's not just a false positive, that actually it may lead potentially to a cardiac issue. Some of these, like ST segment changes, we've known for years. Some of these, like conduction delay through the AV node, we've known. Other of these are a little bit new. Left axis deviation, which if you had me for advanced clinical, we talked about that on Wednesday. How awesome is that? Left atrial enlargement, right ventricular hypertrophy has become very popular in the last 15 years. In fact, in some cultures, there's actually subgroups, some Mediterranean subgroup cultures, we see this very prevalent. Really concerned there. Some other criteria, QT intervals. One of the things we see most often, in fact, we saw it in one of our subjects, is this QT interval is a little bit long. And what that can potentially cause is arrhythmias when they start to exercise. So it's another thing there. Brugada-like syndrome, which I'll talk about that a little bit later. Bradycardia, which most athletes have. Bradycardia is a slow heart rate. Most athletes are going to have slow heart rates, but this is an excessively slow heart rate. And so this criteria gives us hopefully some way to better assess an EKG. So what we decided to do was, all righty, well, let's see if it works. And so what we did is we took athletes here at Palm Beach Atlantic University. All of these were active in the sport they were in. We took 70 subjects, tried to split as much as we could between males and females. Again, all of these were active. Only a couple had any injury, but aside from that, most of them were actively training. And you can see some of the basic demographic background here. And so basically what we did, really simple. Our subjects came in. A lot of these athletes were already coming into the Human Performance Laboratory for other testing, whether it was for basketball doing jump testing, whether it was VO2 max or other things like that. We performed a resting EKG, which was a standard 12-lead setup, which you saw on the slide previously. Got a resting strip, and that was it. Really takes just a couple minutes. And then later on, spent the hours and hours of time using this criteria to analyze every EKG that we had. So here's what we found. Not a lot. Of the 70 subjects we saw, we actually only had 4 that had any abnormality whatsoever. And these are fact of the criteria, these are the only 3 we actually saw. T-wave inversion, which we saw in one subject. Pathological Q waves, which, to give you an idea, that's the first part of the QRS wave is a little bit wide, not the whole QRS. That's the most common one we saw, and not surprisingly, it is one of the more common ones we see in SCD as well. But that was it. The other 60-some-odd subjects, fairly normal. The thing is, though, even though this percentage is low, it actually is in line with what most other studies have found. Most of those studies we looked at found somewhere in about a 2 to 4% prevalence. Ours was about 5%. So although this is rare, and it's a pretty small number, these do exist. Now, just to be clear, we're not a cardiac lab. We don't diagnose. This is simply just research perspective. We are not licensed cardiologists. It's simply taking the criteria and applying it to the EKGs that we had. What we also did is we wanted to do some medical history, and so we used the most simple means we had, which is what's called a PAR-Q inventory, which is probably the most simple means to assess an individual's history, health, medical, and anything related to that. And so we asked them questions, very basic. Have you had a heart condition? Which is kind of a deal. Have you any injuries, any chest pain? And as you'll see from these, we got very few responses. And in fact, the responses we did receive were likely not related to cardiac issues. They tend to be related more to joint issues. We had 2 athletes who had knee injuries at that time, and so more of the conversation was about that. Not a lot of reporting. In fact, these incidence rates are really, really low. So what did we find? Well, it was helpful. I mean, we can't deny that, yeah, we did find percentages of athletes with at least some of these criteria in about the same percent as other studies have found. So that was the good thing. The big question, though, is this useful? And unfortunately, that question is a little tougher to answer. There really, unfortunately, is no real way to know. We can do echocardiograms, we can do MRI to look at vessel abnormalities, but aside from death, which is not an end we want, there's really not an excellent way to know, are we really limiting these false positives? But I think one thing we did see in this is that there is definitely a potential to use it as a tool. It does help eliminate some of the issues that we normally see in athletes. Things like left ventricular hypertrophy. In fact, we actually, afterwards, Vanessa, I had her go back and say, hey, just look at the data, forget about all this criteria, and just tell me like how many left ventricles looked a little more abnormal. And it looked like about a third of them. In other words, a third of our subjects had left ventricular mass a little bit bigger than we expect. But again, that's totally normal. And so this definitely eliminated some of those false positives. Its usefulness, probably still a good question. This semester, we're actually continuing to do this with non-athletes here. Vanessa's doing a lot of that work to try to see if these incident rates are the same in a non-athlete population. And there's some more references, and I'll take any questions. question.
Does sudden cardiac death happen more during practices, or is it in games?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact rate, and because most of the studies that report these, it's simply in the athletic endeavor. So I don't know that there's a lot of data, whether that's practice, game. Unfortunately, I think the ones we hear most about, the ones that end up on YouTube, tend to be in game situations, and those are probably the most frightening ones. But clearly they happen in practice as well. My guess would be probably more in a practice situation, but I don't know if there's hard data to prove that. Yeah. Junior.
I'm not sure if this is a good question, but I was just curious to ask, how different do you think the data or the results of that would be from athletes, which were the test subjects, to someone who's like just physically or moderately active?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and we don't know yet. I'm guessing probably not a whole lot different. If we're seeing individuals who are inactive for certain reasons, maybe we'll see some higher incidences. Not surprisingly, if we're going to have subjects who are sedentary, not active at all, we might see some cardiac issues that are related to like heart disease? Maybe. That's probably not likely at 20, 21 years of age, but maybe it's a little more likely. So I guess it's probably a little more likely, but I'm not really sure. Yeah. Michael.
Dr. Mitchell, do you think more occurrences happen when you use like stimulants during activities, or is it just occurrences that happen in athletes before you think?
Honestly, most of these are non-drug related. And so, now obviously, we don't always know that. But in the majority of cases, though that is a side issue, that is a relevant issue, it's clearly not the sole precipitating factor. I mean, there's autopsy, there's tests you can do afterwards. But even in that, if someone, I don't want to use specific examples, but if someone took some stimulant prior to that, can that potentially cause more issues? Yes. Is that the reason at that point this occurred?
Well, actually, because I know my sport, I run track, so
Yeah.
a lot of guys that I know take caffeine pills and stuff like that.
Sure.
And I don't know if that's particularly healthy, but I know that can speed up the heart rate.
Yeah.
Running.
And I guess it would depend on dose. I mean, if we're talking a fairly moderate dose of caffeine, if you're comparing that, let's take an extreme example, that type of stimulant to cocaine, very different, both stimulants. The effects are quite different though. So unless it's really, really high doses of caffeine, which maybe they're taking that, but I'd hope not. Yeah.
After conducting this study, what is your opinion on ECGs being mandatory as part of a pre-participation examination?
I don't know. I want to know your opinion. I think it's helpful. It's murky. Because this criteria has definitely reduced false positives, but it certainly has not eliminated them. And the reality is, in fact, one study, Dresner, they actually done some follow-up and found that to really get a precise answer is probably going to cost you about $80,000 for each subject. So, and that's, if you have an issue that's going to occur in 1 in 10 people, sure. If it's an issue that occurs in 1 in 40,000, I don't know. Yeah. Awesome.
If a positive or a false positive is detected, are there specific steps to prevent this or to treat it?
Great question. It depends on the etiology. For some of these, there are medications that can potentially be helpful. Some of the electrical abnormalities, some arrhythmogenic right ventricular, that the diagnosis pretty much means stop activity, period. It depends on it. A lot of the cardiomyopathies kind of fall in that category as well. Yeah. Other questions? Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.